concerns the reception of Bergson's philosophy of physics only, in particularly his critique of relativism within Polish philosophical circles, and I focus mainly on the 1920s and 1930s. A formative period both for Bergson's scientific ideas and for the development of philosophy of science and knowledge, and philosophy as such as well. The inspiration for this research comes from, as in Clara's case, from the collaboration in the new Bergson bibliography, for which I thank you, Katarina and Alessandro. I worked on Polish sources, and you can imagine. And while doing so, I noticed something striking. Because in all contemporary Polish philosophy, the topic of duration and simultaneity is almost completely absent. Yet I found during the interwar period some that it was discussed, maybe not extensively, but it was present and intellectually alive. And this contrast made me want to explore how Bergson's ideas on science were once perceived and why they later faded from the view. And to paint the full picture, duration and simultaneity was, in fact, the main subject of my PhD thesis. And actually, all my research was somehow intertwined with your project on global Bergson, because, as I said, in Poland, Bergson is not considered as the main or even an important philosopher, and I struggled to find a forum to which I could talk about his ideas. For example, I presented a presentation at the Polish the biggest Polish philosophical conference, and the feedback was, yeah, it's interesting case, yeah, okay, next. It was not received, like we could intellectually exchange or something like that. And then I came across information that in a few days there will be a conference, and I wished I could participate. And then I noticed it would be online. So for me, your first meeting in America online was a blessing, because I could indeed participate, and I get to know all these wonderful people who are pursuing Bergson in contemporary context as well, not only as a historical curiosity, but as a life philosophy and thought. And then I was also well received at your meeting in Japan, where I presented the initial part of my research in my PhD, and I was very impressed by your contributions and your warming welcome. So I want to express my gratitude and thanks to Said, to Katerina, and to all of you for this warm welcome. And now I feel I have a home, Bergson home, so thank you very much. That's on personal note. And now with my research, with my presentation. So when I saw that in history there were cases of Bergson's reception in Poland, I mean Bergson's scientific ideas, Bergson as a philosopher of science, because that was one of the main arguments in my PhD, that he was and should be regarded as a philosopher of science, philosopher of physics in particular. I was wondering whether it could be supported by historical record of Polish philosophical writings. And as it turns out, the answer is yes. And in this presentation, I will try to show you why this is the case. To begin with, let me briefly outline what the practice of philosophy in Poland looked like at the beginning of the 20th century, since this context shaped the way Bergson's ideas were received. At that time, Poland did not exist as an independent state, and its territories were divided between three countries, and intellectual life developed differently in each of these three regions. the most vibrant philosophical and scientific center was in Lviv, today's Ukraine. Then it was territory of Poland, the capital of Galicia. It was part of Austrian-Hungary, and they enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy, and thus it was possible to develop philosophy and science. In Lviv, there was the University of Lviv and also the Polytechnic School, which was the only polytechnic school in the country. And they both created a space for close exchange between philosophers and scientists. And the students and professors were inspired by thinkers such as Poincaré and Mach, and they explored questions at the intersection of physics and philosophy, particularly those arising from the new theories of space and time. I forgot to mention that the Galicia region is the yellow part on the map. It's where the Lviv is located. During the 1920s, when Poland regained its independence, Lviv was still a center of Polish philosophy and became a major site for philosophical discussions on Einstein's theory of relativity. And beside the academia, the exchanges took place, for example, on the congresses of Polish physicians and naturalists, where they discussed also the emerging ideas coming from relativity. Another key development at that time was the rise of the so-called Lviv-Warsaw School, founded in Lviv by the philosopher Kazimierz Twardowski. Twardowski was a student of one of the professors at the Vienna Circle and took this philosophical approach in his Lviv-Warsaw School. And the school soon became the most important philosophical center in Poland. Its focus was largely on epistemology and the methodology of science with rigorous analytical methods and conceptual precision. At first glance, this might seem to contrast sharply with Bergson's intuition-centered approach, especially since, while Bergson maintained that logical analysis alone could not capture the dynamic, intuitive aspects of experience, the members of the school were cautious not to let the broader metaphysical interpretations overstep the boundaries of what they want to create, scientific philosophy. However, it was within this precise intellectual milieu that most of the titled Forgotten Dialogues took place, which is curious. Other important centers included Krakow, with its Jagiellonian University, where they were developed the philosophy of nature, but there was almost none of accounts on Bergson, so I will not discuss it further. And later, the philosophy was also developed in Warsaw, where the re-established University of Warsaw gathered many leading scholars from Lviv. The university was reopened in 1915, and one of the main philosophers there was Jan Łukasiewicz, for example, which he was a student of Kazimierz Twardowski and logician, with the strict analytical approach to doing philosophy. However, it was within this intellectual dynamic environment, I mean mostly Polytechnic School and the University of Lviv, where the scientific and philosophical discussions constantly overlapped with the first Polish responses to both Bergson's philosophy and Einstein's relativity began to take shape. Before turning to Polish engagement with particularly Bergson's critique of relativity, I should also briefly outline the broader reception of Bergson's philosophy as such in Poland. One of the earliest works to attract attention was Laughter, and it was translated into Polish in 1902, and it was the first Bergson book to appear in Poland. The following year, it was reviewed by Adam Marbut in Ogniwo. It's the text on the right. It's On the Laughter, the title. And the interest in Bergson's thought reached its peak after the publication of Creative Evolution in 1907, and even more so following its Polish translation in 1920. And from the outset, the reception of Bergson in Poland was marked by divergent interpretations and persistent stereotypes. The most common label was that of irrationalism. However, in the early phase of reception, Bergson was often regarded as an intellectualist philosopher. It was only later, with the introduction of the notion of intuition, in the introduction to metaphysics, that his philosophy came to be associated in Poland with mysticism or anti-scientific thinking. And this frequent misunderstanding would have a lasting influence on how Bergson's philosophy of science was perceived and evaluated in Poland. You can see on the bottom, it's an example of one of the articles in 1920s by Wasserberg. It's called Bergson's Irrationalism, and it was common then to see articles like that. And when we turn to contemporary scholarship, we can see that stereotype of irrationalism persisted. Modern Polish studies rarely engage with Bergson's analysis of the theory of relativity, and when they do, it is usually in the form of brief biographical notes or anecdotal mentions, often highlighting the famous dispute between Bergson and Einstein, which Bergson is generally considered to have lost. Even famous philosopher Barbara Skarga only mentions this as on 1 or 2 pages as exactly biographical notes. And what is important, duration and simultaneity remains untranslated into Polish and is seldom recognized as a major work within his whole body of works. Even when from my personal experience, I get to know that many of philosophers are not aware of the book, and nor of his encounter with Einstein, or that Bergson had anything to do with science as such. Even when Bergson's reflections on relativity are discussed, in contemporary philosophy today, they are often framed through the critical lens of Michał Heller, which is a famous Polish philosopher of physics. He's a philosopher and a physicist, hence the authority, and he's also a priest, which is huge in Poland, and the authority gains itself. And his interpretation has been frequently reiterated in the secondary literature. And Heller essentially considers that Bergson was mistaken, that his reflection on relativity do not present significant value, and would certainly not regard Bergson as a philosopher of science or his work as part of philosophy of physics. And you can see on the left side, there is because Heller wrote an article on Bergson encounter with relativity, and at the end there is the warning in Polish not to pursue relativity in the way Bergson did if you want to stay regarded as sane philosopher and someone who is legitimate to say anything about philosophy. As a result, Bergson's engagement with contemporary scientific developments is largely overlooked, treated as if Heller's account had definitely settled the matter. I can also add my own experience as well, because when I was organizing in Poland a seminar on Bergson within another big Polish conference, I reached out to those few people that dared to write something about Bergson, and 2 of them actually, professors, wrote to me that they are aware of Heller's account, but they actually do enjoy Bergson. So if it's gonna be like this shaming Bergson, they don't want to take part in that. I had to I reassure them that I'm taking it seriously and I'm not, I don't want to just criticize him, but analyze his thoughts. And yeah, and they came. Nonetheless, as I will show, in the early 20th century, there were prominent Polish philosophers of science who did engage seriously with Bergson's ideas, and they saw his work as a significant contribution to thinking about science and valued Bergson as a philosopher of science in his own right. The most substantial Polish engagements with Bergson's philosophy of science can be found in the work of three members of the Warsaw School, that is Zygmunt Zawirski, Henryk Melberg, and Isidora Dąbska. They addressed the philosophical problems and implications arising from contemporary physics, particularly in the wake of Einstein's relativity, and all three regarded Bergson as a leading contemporary philosopher and reflected critically on his evaluation of relativity. A complementary perspective comes from Joachim Mettelmann, a professor at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, philosopher of nature. His writings further illuminate how Bergson's ideas were received within the Polish philosophical context. First, I turn to Zygmunt Zawirski, a student of Kazimierz Twardowski and later a professor at the universities of Poznań and Krakow. He was a leading figure of the Warsaw School and one of the most important Polish philosophers of his time. His work focused on the conceptual foundations and philosophical implications of contemporary physics, particularly relativity. From early on, Zawirski recognized the importance of Bergson for understanding the evolving relationship between human experience and physical theory. In a 1920 article in Polish Philosophical Review, he drew on Bergson to distinguish between physical and psychological time, showing how measurement transforms lived experience into a relative, scientifically quantifiable form. This was also one of the first Polish contributions to discussions of relativity. In his 1921 monograph, called The Physical Theory of Relativity and Philosophical Relativism, Zawirski engaged more systematically with Bergson's reflections on science, even before duration and simultaneity appeared. Zawirski actually was awaiting Bergson's answer to Einstein's relativity, and he was certain that it will be it will happen. Zawirski highlighted Bergson's critique of purely empirist or rationalist approaches and explored how intuition might interface with scientific knowledge, stressing the need to incorporate empirical findings for a comprehensive view of reality. Zawirski praised Bergson's flexibility in addressing philosophical problems while offering a measured critique. He was not only appraising Bergson, but also criticized him, noting that intuitive knowledge, or what he called intellectual sympathy, may appeal to artists, but does not fully satisfy reflective reasoning. So we can see the fluctuations in Zawirski works, where the influences of his teachers were shown, and he was cautious to engage with Bergson. That is all, in my opinion, it's all the more reason to review his account, because it was from the different sides he looked at Bergson's work. And when Duration and Simultaneity was actually published, Zawirski assessed Bergson's position, and he emphasized that given the centrality of time in Bergson's philosophy, Bergson just could not ignore this theory. And otherwise, in Zawirski's opinion, Bergson's philosophy would not be actual, but would fade into the past. And he recognized in his review of Duration and Simultaneity, Zawirski recognized Bergson's engagement with the human understanding of time and valued his insights, even if he misunderstood some aspects. In my opinion, the most important misunderstanding was that Zawierski thought Bergson was attempting to defend Newtonian universal time rather than the unity of real time in a relativistic context. But in Zawierski's defense, he was influenced also by and was creating and commenting on within German tradition. And at the end of this review, he actually recommended to read Duration and Simultaneity because in his opinion, it was the best defense of universal time we can read, at least within German literature. Later in his 1936 study, The Development of the Concept of Time, Zawierski offered a comprehensive account of the development of the concept of time in philosophy and science, and he considered Bergson's conception particularly valuable for clarifying the relation between physical and psychological time, and positioned Bergson as a vital interlocutor for interpreting modern physics rather than just a critic of scientific rationality. Across his career, Zawierski consistently acknowledged the philosophical significance of Bergson's ideas for the evolving understanding of science. I will now turn to a second Polish philosopher of science, Henryk Malberg. He was a student of Twardowski and Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz, another leading member of the Lwów Warsaw School. Malberg was an important Polish philosopher of science in the interwar period, and later he was initially based in Lwów and later emigrated to North America, holding positions at the University of Chicago and the University of Toronto. Here's at the photo, he's with his more famous wife. Now it's you can know of her from the last year's book about the Polish Countess. Actually, she was posed as one. She was not. She was of Jewish descendant, but during this time, you might say, she actually rescued a lot of Jewish people. And I think last year it was published in a book in English about her actions. Yeah, so I'm talking about her husband. Like Zawierski, Malberg devoted considerable attention to the theory of relativity and engaged with Bergson, giving a series of lectures in the 1930s in Lwów on the Bergson-Einstein debate, situating his reflections on time and scientific theory within a broader philosophical context. During this initial period, Malberg reapproached Bergson for, in his opinion, clinging to what he considered an outdated, mechanistic view of physical phenomena, but he, at the same time, praised Bergson's creative reinterpretation of Darwinian evolution and his analysis of perception and memory. This interplay of critique and admiration adequately illustrates Malberg's disciplined approach. He evaluated Bergson's work differently depending on the philosophical problem under consideration and moving from critical scrutiny to a more balanced appreciation of Bergson's contributions. In his 1935 essay sur la théorie causale du temps, Malberg acknowledged Bergson's important critique of the traditional parallelism between time and space, highlighting the non-spatial character of temporality. He also wrote articles where, for example, he drew comparisons between Bergson and Husserl, noting parallels between Bergson's concept of pure duration and Husserl's absolute flux. He observed the influence of both of them on the psychiatrist Eugene Minkowski, though he emphasized that Minkowski, unlike Bergson, neglected to incorporate scientific data into his account of time. Malberg also engaged directly with Bergson's critique of relativity in duration and simultaneity, endorsing the central insight that concept of simultaneity and succession underpinning physical phenomena are ultimately grounded in intuition of those. He extended this into his own causal theory of time, encompassing both physical and extra-physical phenomena like mental states. By the end of his life, Malberg regarded Bergson not only as a metaphysician, but as a philosopher of physics, whose analysis of time, perception, and evolution provided valuable insight for the philosophy of science. He saw Bergson as a crucial interlocutor, helping to mediate between scientific innovation and human understanding. In the preface to the English translation of his essay, published shortly after his death in 1979, the translation was published in 1980, Malberg explicitly identified Bergson as one of the philosophers of physics who made significant contributions to the field despite lacking formal training in physics. He further emphasized that in commenting on the latest scientific developments, including Einstein's relativity, Bergson acted alongside other philosophical commentators as a mediator between scientific innovation and the broader human understanding. It's in the quote here, the exact wording Malberg used in English also. In this role, in Malberg's view, Bergson helped articulate what these scientific breakthroughs meant for our human experience of time. The third member of the Warsaw School to comment on Bergson's relativity was Izydora Domska. She was a student of Kazimierz Twardowski as well. Actually, she was his personal assistant, and she was an important member of the circle. Although her engagement with Bergson was more limited than that of her colleagues, it is significant for illustrating how the reception of Bergson evolved in Poland. In the 1930s, Domska adopted a distinctly critical stance, which reflected the prevailing perception of Bergson as an irrationalist. In her article, Irrationalism and Scientific Knowledge, she argued that science should on its own eliminate irrational elements and pursue full rationalization within its own domain. She classified Bergsonism alongside Heraclitean thought as a form of epistemological and metaphysical irrationalism. However, over time, Domska's view by the late 1950s, she explicitly acknowledged Bergson's influence on the philosophy of science, and at the 1959 Bergson Congress, in her paper Sur quelqu'un idée commune à Bergson, Poincaré, Eddington, she highlighted how Bergson's ideas influenced scientists, including Eddington. She noted that scientific knowledge, while rigorous, deals with relations rather than the intrinsic qualities of things, and that intuition, as Bergson emphasized, accesses dimensions of reality beyond the purely rational. Domska also contrasted this with Poincaré's view, where scientific knowledge in her account provides an intersubjectively communicable, approximate structure of the world, emphasizing that Bergson aimed to grasp the very essence of reality. Her engagement shows a careful, evolving philosophical reflection. She moved from initial skepticism to recognizing relevance of Bergson's thought for scientific reasoning, intuition, and the philosophy of physics. And while less extensive than Zabierski and Malberg, Domska's work demonstrates how Bergson's philosophy continued to stimulate rigorous debate and inform sophisticated assessments of the relationship between science and philosophy. Finally, it is worth mentioning Joachim Mettelmann, a Polish philosopher of nature. Unlike the other three, Mettelmann was not a member of the Warsaw School. His work developed within the broader framework of the philosophy of nature in Krakow, and he engaged with Bergson primarily through the lens of Whitehead's philosophy of science and metaphysics. Mettelmann argued, his argument mainly from the article listed there, The Philosophy of Nature and the Theory of Knowledge of Whitehead. He argued that Whitehead's conception of reality shows clear traces of Bergsonian influence. Both thinkers, he suggested, sought a conception of reality that goes beyond mathematical formalism, emphasizing immediacy and recognizing creative becoming as fundamental to the world. For Mettelmann, reality and its apprehension are dynamic. Knowledge is never complete, and Bergson's metaphysical system remains provisional, aiming to overcome entrenched dualisms such as quality versus quantity, while also affirming the diversity of the world and the embodied character of experience. He further observed that Bergson distinguished creative time, the continuous flux of nature, from the serial, measurable time of physics, rejecting any reduction of time to a mere fourth dimension of space. Bergson, in Mettelmann's reading, sought a form of absolute knowledge that science alone cannot provide, supplementing empirical investigation with metaphysical reflection and returning through intuition to the immediacy of lived reality. His focus, Mettelmann emphasized, was on grasping reality itself rather than constructing theoretical representations. Although Mettelmann's engagement with Bergson was mediated through Whitehead, his reflections clearly adhere to Bergson's critique of relativity, thus complementing the contributions of Zawierski, Malberg, and Domska. Together, these thinkers show that in Poland, Bergson's duration and simultaneity was taken seriously as a genuine work within the philosophy of physics, approached with both intellectual rigor and philosophical openness. To conclude, first, the reception of Bergson in Poland was most pronounced among members of the Warsaw School, even though the school's methodological principle, its focus on analytic precision, logical clarity, and epistemology, did not naturally align with Bergson's philosophy focused on dynamic aspects of reality. This engagement illustrates a distinctive feature of Polish philosophical practice at the time, a combination of rigorous analytical reasoning with openness to alternative conceptions of science, alongside the diversity of thought within a cohesive intellectual milieu. At the same time, philosophers outside the school, such as Mettelmann, demonstrated that engagement with Bergson was not confined to one intellectual circle, highlighting the broader relevance of his ideas for the philosophy of nature and scientific reflection. Moreover, as I have shown, the early 20th century Polish philosopher of science did not regard Bergson as indifferent to contemporary scientific developments. Figures such as Zawierski, Malberg, and Domska actively engaged with his thought, recognizing him as a serious philosopher of science, despite his lack of a formal training in physics. They treated duration and simultaneity not as a marginal or purely speculative work, but as a substantial contribution to the philosophical understanding of time and relativity. Importantly, this historical reception contrasts sharply with contemporary Polish scholarship, which rarely engages with Bergson's philosophy of physics. Unlike modern accounts, which treat Bergson's philosophy of physics anecdotically or even reject it, early Polish thinkers took him seriously, critically examining his ideas while recognizing their potential to illuminate both scientific and metaphysical questions. The decline of Bergson's influence in Poland cannot be attributed solely to the perception of his irrationalism. It also reflects broader methodological shifts within the philosophy of science, which increasingly prioritize formal, analytic, and linguistic approaches over discussions on concrete scientific theories. Revisiting these historical engagements allow us to appreciate the nuanced and sophisticated way in which Bergson was once integrated into scientific and philosophical discourse. Ultimately, the Polish reception of Bergson demonstrates that philosophical reflection on science can be rigorous, critical and open to conceptual innovation, while also attending to the human and metaphysical significance of scientific inquiry. By highlighting these largely forgotten dialogues, we can reconsider Bergson's philosophy of physics on its own terms and recognize the enduring value of his contributions to the philosophy of science. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna. Tout de suite, la parole à vos collègues.
Thank you, Anna. It was so magnificent presentation. It's actually very peculiar to not want to see Bergson as a scientific philosopher, isn't it? I mean, he engaged in almost all major works with actual science. So with physics and psychophysics, as well as mathematics in the time of free will, physics and psychology and memory, biology and creative freedom. So I wonder, where does it actually stem from to not want to see that this is a scientific philosopher? So you mentioned in Poland the importance of introduction to metaphysics as one of the origin. Could you give a more global account of why Bergson is actually not or was not read as a scientific philosopher? For instance, put the quarrel with Russell in that, especially about mathematics, and mathematics. I mean, we who do research on Bergson knows he was a brilliant mathematician. So I wonder, where are the origins? I mean, okay, there's Lukács and his famous book on rationalism, and where does the idea stem from that it could not be a philosopher of science or an unscientific philosopher?
Thank you very much for this question, because actually this is the kind of question I would certainly not receive in Poland, because it is assumed that Bergson was not and had not to do anything with science. Maybe biology, but no one pursuing that angle. And I'm only impersonating average Polish philosopher. I mean, biology is not science, you know. Yeah, but the jokes aside, I think what played a part, for sure, it was the quarrel with, as you said, with Bertrand Russell, and it discredited Bergson. Also, in Poland, it is important to look at the Catholic philosophy, because it plays an important part, and also Catholic reception of Bergson was primarily in Krakow, and they were inspired by Maritain's critique. So there is that. And also, as we are speaking about Catholic philosophy, you have this huge center of Catholic philosophy, where they are now pursuing Aristotelian thought, which is more scientific than Bergson. And they are actually now, what is considered philosophy of science in Poland is, for example, the new mechanism and new mechanistic theories. And it is this, you might say, hardcore, because the members of the Warsaw School wanted to do, as I said, scientific philosophy. It had to do with logic, and if you cannot persuade someone about your conception, for example, of truth by logical, by logic, you are not a philosopher of science there. So I think the answer is from different angles. You need to look at that, because Bergson took harsh criticism from every part of important thought in Poland. So you can now understand how I don't feel at home there, because yeah, actually, I can also share that, for example, on my PhD, which is on Bergson's critique of relativity. There was actually no Polish professors except one that would agree to write a review of my doctorate, because they either don't consider it relevant or they do not know physics and they do not want to approach it. So yes, I don't know how to answer that.
Were philosophers of science a little bit, under the influence of the Vienna school, logical positivism,
Yes.
mainly?
Yes, the Warsaw School was very much influenced by the Vienna circle. There are actually some publications on whether there are differences between the two.
Mm.
There are some, but not that huge.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. You have to forgive me for asking the historical question, which is about the institutional location of the individuals you discussed. You gave us some background around the kind of, location in Poland and the way in which that might have impacted their thought. But I'm curious, was there similarly that we saw in, for instance, Clara's discussion, a kind of Bergsonian impulse to reform institutional spaces in which these conversations were happening, maybe in scientific discourses or the location of sciences in the Polish Academy? Have you found any way in which Bergson's thought was articulated in that kind of issue, or is this primarily limited to a discussion around what counts as a philosophy of science and what doesn't?
Okay, thank you for the question. I need to make clear that I only focus on Bergson's philosophy of science in this presentation.
Sure.
It doesn't cover the whole reception of Bergson because, for example, the most important of his work, judging by the number of translations, for example, is matter memory. So it is considered important to some extent. And for example, there is one researcher in Wrocław that is currently actively pursuing Bergson's philosophy of knowledge and such. So there are those accounts. I do not claim that there is none, although in comparison, you might say as well. But as for the institutions, I did not came across any account, but that doesn't have to be, extensive because I did not look into this topic. And if you do, you might see otherwise. But what I can say within this this approach, this philosophy of science, is one curious thing that the first account of Bergson's philosophy through the lenses of the terms from relativity theory were brought by even before Duration and Simultaneity was published. It was in 1910s, in 1990, or even before, by Polish engineer from Polytechnic School. Actually, if you can compare the University of Lviv and Polytechnic School, you can find that Polytechnic was more open to that sort of thought, and engineers actually took some of the thoughts of Bergson also to incorporate their reflections on the intersections of science and philosophy. So you might say engineers were more open to this kind of thinking than the philosophers themselves.
Could you say that, sorry, just really quickly, could you say that there is more interest in Bergson's larger writings because in the Polytechnic there is a more applied as opposed to theoretical interest in science and its implications for?
Yes, but I also have to note that I'm only speaking historically because I researched how it was at the early 20th century. So, for example, the very first one was Bergson. He was an engineer from Polytechnic in Lviv. And yes, I think it did play an important part that they could thought about the approach was, as I imagine from what I read, is that they were talking, actively speaking about the intersections of science and philosophy in order to think about their technical, it's not very creative. I'm not knowledgeable in that terminology. Sorry. Yeah, but yeah, I think in
Thank you. Yeah, donc,
Sorry, because you don't have eyes on your back. But no, and thank you very much. It's just a consideration and a question. After all these commentaries, you made me think with this itinerary in the Polish reception of a possible parallel with the Italian reception at some point. But quite paradoxical because in Italy as well there was this irrationalist stigma of Bergson, very hard also because of a possible influence on fascism that made it very difficult in the second half of the 20th century to approach Bergson in the academic domain. It was very likely that if you arrived with a Bergson project, you didn't get a position, and that was quite mathematical. But from the philosophers of science came the first reprise of Bergson's works, and especially from psychology. So I don't know if you considered also the psychological field in this philosophy of science, or you were especially focused on the physics and your main interest, or maybe all these translations of matter and memory maybe might have given rise to a debate also on the history of psychology that gave an idea of a person, of a rationalist person as well, or a new intellectualism that might be connected to Bergson's philosophy.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, from what you said, there seem to be indeed connections with the reception, because irrationalist was also and is still a stigma on Bergson's reception and thinking of his philosophy. And I must add that it happened because of the term intuition, and not actually what it represents in Bergson's philosophy. I have to make it clear that Polish philosophers think of intuition as a gut feeling, and that's why it's irrationalist. And as for psychology, I have to be honest, I did not pursue this angle, but I imagine that for the debates I was talking about, that is the Lwów Warsaw School, and those philosophers, hardcore philosophers, psychology does not also represent scientific thinking, unfortunately. And they actually, I can, but yeah, I mean, this may be the topic worth pursuing, because they may be traces, like, for example, and I know this from my experience and my readings, Bergson is huge among literature, and those who study literature, for example, my friends from human departments and who studies Polish literature and international literature, they know of Bergson, whereas my colleagues from philosophy did not even heard of Bergson. But among scholars that pursue literature, it is important thinker, for example, for Vital, and thinking about that. And I actually knew Bergson from my high school, from Polish classes on Fin de siècle and so on. So it is, and I imagine maybe similarly in the psychology also he is important. I just didn't encounter that, but maybe you're right. Maybe it is worth pursuing. I only focused on this, hardcore philosophers of science to see whether or not we can like poke a little hole in their coherent thought and to see whether Bergson could actually be placed there and whether he can be perceived as an important and scientific thinker and instead of this irrationalist.
Okay.
Just a quick question. You mentioned that the Bergson is more known in the literary field rather than the philosopher one. Is there a sort of like process that made that the Bergson reception, the Bergson, let's say, canonization in Poland was in the literary field and not in the philosophical one, like the teaching or like something that I don't know in France with the philosopher like Diderot, like that were long time until 10 years ago, 20 years ago studied as in literary field, not in the philosophical one. But similar process occurred to Bergson. I don't know if in high school programs, but in maybe university, as university in literature and faculties of literature, the courses on Bergson, while all century.
Yes, that's exactly the case because Bergson was well received within literary circles and he inspired many of Polish writers, but also poets, both positively and negatively. And the negative examples, for example, Bergson, who despised him and criticized him without merit. But there were a number of Polish writers that drew extensively on his thought and incorporated the main concepts in their works, mainly from creative evolution, from what I understand. I did not did the whole research on this, but I know of the big reception of Bergson in literature. And as for the university, yes, they teach Bergson, not as a separate courses maybe, but within it's incorporated in the curriculum. They are taught during their studies. So this is for sure. Whereas at philosophy course, we had Bergson only. I knew first of Bergson from laughter because he is taught in the anthropology course.
Maybe because of his Nobel Prize in Literature.
Yes.
Thank you. Anna, il y a d'autres questions? Bien. Vous avez une pause de 5 minutes. Et après, on reprend.